we started to throw around a few ideas. And I really like this Theology on Tap format that you guys have, where, this is, in today's world, we're having to respond to the new need. And I like that we can do this even online, even 12 hours apart. I think that's really cool. And so Alan and I started talking about Theology of Service, which is something that is close to my heart, and how that fits within a paradigm of incarnational living. So I hope I set that up sufficiently for you, Alan, if you want to take the reins from there.
I think that's good. I think you can speak to a lot of things, and just, John, when you came to Oral Roberts, you came from, I think, a very similar background to me, kind of Pentecostal, charismatic, AG-ish, and kind of came through the gamut of the apostolic side, and are now part of the Greek Orthodox Church yourself, and also working within a pan-Orthodox community. And I think that also opens up our conversation doctrinally to some things that maybe as in the Protestant world, we don't really emphasize as much. So I'm looking forward to kind of seeing how maybe just asking as we go forward, your own life kind of fits into this, and the stories of your own kind of evolution as a Christian, as a thinker, and what it means in your own work, which is, I think you've touched on well enough. So why don't you introduce the topic? It was a topic I was super excited to hear about, because I think it fits really well in this Lenten season. And it was before the coronavirus kind of hit America. But I think there's a lot of good questions we can ask of what that looks like in a very different world now, or what it looks like with the different normals. So why don't you introduce and we'll get into it?
So the incarnation is something that is central to our faith as Christians, no matter what branch of Christianity we belong to, no matter what we consider our tribe. The incarnation is central because something like nothing had ever happened in history took place that upended the way we encounter God. So there is this epistemological question, how we encounter God. And that's something that Israel had wrestled with and wrote extensively about in their canon over thousands of years. And I think sometimes the authors reflected what their own culture dictated about how human beings encountered God. And frankly, some things needed to be clarified, which is why God, in his divinity, chose to incarnate himself in the second person of the Trinity, the Word of God, in the flesh of Jesus Christ.
And that's what
now, the reason that is,
right? And just in case anybody's not quite clear on what we mean by the term.
Yes, that's exactly right. So God assumed flesh. God took on a human suit and became a person. And he was fully God, fully man, 100% of each, and lived the way we live, experienced our problems, had our same issues, shared in our suffering. And the reason that was important is because it was the way that God allowed us to take on divinity. By coming down and living as a human being, assuming the human flesh and sharing in the human condition, God sanctified humanity. He sanctified the entire world by incarnating himself in it, by existing just by the very presence of God being in the world as a person, sanctified everything around him. And that includes our own humanity. So why is that important, 2,000 years later? This is actually one of the things that I think about because I have to all the time. I manage the programs for operations all over the United States, and I'm in close to 70 communities, but I can't be everywhere at once. It's impossible. There's not enough time in my calendar to do that. but there are occasions where it is necessary for me to show up and work alongside a person. Because what I've found is that when you are in service-oriented ministry, when you are, for lack of a better term, a professional Christian, where you are serving those who are disenfranchised, vulnerable members of society, displaced populations, home insecure, unless you are willing to demonstrate in a very real and tangible way that you are there with that person and not for that person, it's hard to have a shared transformational experience. So one of the things that I like to talk about, and I've heard a couple other members of my organization, is that we don't fix the people that we're serving, because that implies that they exist as broken entities and we view them as whole people. Rather, we serve them because it puts them on a position of equality with us. They are working on the same journey towards theosis, or sanctification, towards God, as we are. And it really doesn't matter, who's in front of who. That doesn't really exist, because the reality is that at various points of time, we can go up and down the proverbial ladder of closeness and how we feel to God. But all that really means is, how responsive are we to the God who is around us at all times? Because like I stated earlier, God already sanctified the entire universe when he incarnated himself. And so I take that as an example. If I am an icon of Christ, if I am supposed to be reflective of the one who I worship and who I completely base my life around, then I need to be incarnational. So, for example, if I am building a program in Allen's neck of the woods, up in the New York, New Jersey area, and I'm going to like 7 churches and saying, hey, we need to get together and gather some basic necessities for a population of individuals who are either at risk of going into a shelter or are trying their hardest to transition out of one. Will you work together with me and with these other communities so that we can get things like toilet paper, shampoo, soap, any kind of basic necessity that you might need to carry on your daily life? Can you raise the money for that? Can you come here on a specific day where an event is organized with our community partner, usually with like a resource center or a emotional or behavioral health center, something like that, where we tap into an organization who has access to this type of clientele that we can serve, and bringing people around, not just to learn about or understand what it means to serve alongside another person in an incarnational fashion, meaning you are right there with them. You are putting yourself in their world, but you are experiencing it. This is something that this is the most important part of the whole idea of service, is existing with the person you're served, living their life alongside of them, showing them that you value their humanity, you are acknowledging, you're recognizing their inherent dignity as a person who has been created by the same God who created you, and you're there to serve them so that they can help meet their basic needs. So just recently I was at an event where some really brilliant minds, there were a couple of professors, one from Harvard and some people who are organizing some think tanks in different parts of the world about the crisis of homelessness. And one of the professors said something, it's interesting how, we call it a homeless crisis, and yet really what it is a housing crisis. There is a wealth disparity that exists, and this is not just an American problem. I understand this exists everywhere. But the people who don't have because for whatever reason, they are on fixed or disability income, and they just can't keep up with rising costs of life. And the problem exists to the degree that we almost need a proverbial surgery to take place. Like, we need changes at policy level, wide sweeping, big picture changes that need to take place in the United States and in other parts of the world, but especially the United States, where this problem is exacerbated. And I acknowledge that as a person who can take a look at the big picture and say, okay, well, yeah, of course, that makes sense. We need to address these large issues. But at the same time, if a person, to use the analogy that I just threw out there, if a person requires surgery and a person goes to, 3 different doctors, and they're like, yeah, your issue, you have this infected wound, and it's so incredibly infected that you are going to need surgery. We're going to need to dig everything out, clean the wound, and fix from there. That may all be true, but what you need to do first, without ignoring that sophisticated second step, is clean and anesthetize the wound in order for the surgery to be able to have any degree of success. So what that could mean for the most vulnerable members of society is going into their community, being with them, alongside them, serving them, and giving them something that they require in order to just have that basic dignity of life. If a person is unable to access some of the most basic needs, it's really hard to imagine how they can have any other part of their life operating with any sort of order, if that makes any sense.
It does. Well, it's good work that you do, and I think that there's quite a lot there. I appreciate from my own experience coming into, as I broadened my own theological readings, coming across the Eastern Fathers, coming across a more incarnationally driven view of salvation, and that more an idea where salvation is something that is happened, and will happen, and that sanctification, that the idea of theosis is directly interwoven into what it means to actually be saved. And this idea that in the incarnation, there's this sense of Christ healing matter, healing our humanity, restoring humanness, restoring human nature. And I think that if you hear that, at least, then it drives this whole idea of, well, what does it mean to love people, to reconcile, to embody the same mission of Jesus? Well, the incarnation is where we start, not just the cross. And they kind of can't be separated, right? I hate when we kind of chop up Jesus' life or the ministry of Jesus into these, like, oh, it's, he was born to die, rather than seeing the entire life and death and resurrection, and particularly birth or in ministry, particularly the teachings. All of it is woven in together into one cosmically life-shifting or cosmic shifting moment for the universe.
Well, that's exactly right. And the incarnation doesn't just refer to the conception or the birth of Jesus. It is his entire life. Like, you can't have an incarnation, an understanding of the incarnation, without Jesus in the temple, without his suffering in the garden, without his death, his resurrection, without him going to Thomas and having him place his hands in his wounds. That's all incarnational. He put his entire being in our lives, in our history, in our world, so that we can experience that same kind of glorification that he ultimately demonstrated to us in the end of the Gospels and in early Acts. And I think that's the important part that we have to hold on to, is like you said, it's easy and even tempting to compartmentalize the different portions of Jesus' life and ascribe varying levels of significance to each one. But when you look at it from a comprehensive whole, you see that all parts are necessary in order to get the complete picture of not just who Jesus was, but why he was here, his purpose. And his purpose was to deify the universe, take what was natural and make it supernatural. Everything is sacred when it is touched by the divinity of Jesus Christ.
And I love